just set up.
Delaney, you're a psychology major or in journalism or what?
Yeah, so I'm a third year student and I'm doing psychology. And then with like the whole design your degree, currently my degree title that I've gotten to design is social psych oh wait, oh gosh. Psychology and social behavior is the name of my degree title.
Okay.
So yes, that's what we're going with right now.
Okay, great.
And so then what was your major when you were here at Antioch?
Psychology.
Psychology. I didn't know because some people will go into like the master's program and then choose psychology. So were you pretty dead set then?
Well, in a sense, I was initially, I think, interested in psychology the way a lot of undergrads are, namely that I thought I wanted to do clinical work. Actually, the co-op program was pretty important to me that way because having first a job in Boston working with chronic alcoholics, and then a job at a halfway house and day treatment center in Palo Alto, California, which were great jobs, and I enjoyed them and learned a lot. But they were fairly influential in convincing me not to do clinical work. And that was based actually on, and then I also did Antioch education abroad and spent a whole year in Scotland at the University of Aberdeen, where I was actually exposed to, frankly, more scientific, sort of psychology than I had been so far at Antioch. And well, I really liked the science, and I had also concluded from doing the co-ops, and I think this might be less true today, that we really lacked an adequate scientific basis for knowing how to help people, which is not to say there wasn't, like, it was wonderful that people wanted to try. I mean, there's people suffering, you've got to do what you can, but it was not a scientific approach, really. And in part because we didn't understand enough about the human mind, the human brain, the underlying neurophysiology and cellular mechanisms, and et cetera, et cetera. I do think that has changed I got a BA in 1972, so we're talking close to half a century. So I'm kind of proud of like my little part in how much I think that has changed.
Yeah, it was really interesting because I took an intro to like developmental psychology and we were reading some of your work. And so that was kind of like I don't know, the introduction to like Antioch alumni who went on to like do, for the lack of a better word, real research and had like a real impact on their like field. And so I guess so you bridged the gap from like not wanting to do clinical psychology to wanting to do research psychology. Did you do any like projects while you were here at Antioch to kind of like cement that?
Well, I did do like sort of the start of a senior thesis, but I designed it and I sort of did it with 4 or 5 kids. It wasn't really a proper research project. What I would say was more important was having a sort of, I don't know, half-time co-op job working at the Fells Research Center, which at that time, I think it's since moved, housed the Fells Longitudinal Study, which was a study that was launched in Ohio in, I think, the 1940s, and had followed kids from basically birth through 20 or something like that. And the data were still being kind of analyzed and probed. Maybe it even started in the 30s. It was started by someone called Lester Sontag. But at that point, there was a guy called Bob McCall, who was sort of leading the analyses. And I worked with him. I also took statistics from him because he did some teaching across the street. And that really introduced me to sort of real research, like big time research, which I think in some ways is more important to get a window into than the little bits you can frankly do as a senior thesis, especially at a liberal arts college. Um, and also bridged my way to grad school because he had been a postdoc with Jerry Kagan at Harvard, which is the program I eventually went to for my PhD. So that was also important.
Nice. That's really cool to hear kind of like the process of it, especially as someone who's like looking to go into grad school and further education and all that jazz.
Yeah.
Um, and so I guess like to go back a little bit is like, why did you even want to come to Antioch in the first place? Um,
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you know, especially because I grew up in Canada, and people in Canada, and this is really still true today, are quite unlikely to come to the United States for what Americans call college. In the US, college means getting a BA. In Canada, it actually basically means going to a community college. You have to go to university to get a BA. I mean, it's a different system. And not only that, they don't typically go that far away. So I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, and I would say the vast majority of my graduating class went to McMaster, and then a few like mavericks went to the University of Western Ontario or University of Toronto or something. Um, but there were a few things. One is that I did want um, in my own inchoate 16-year-old way. I mean, it's funny to think back on it. Most Canadian universities, and at that time overwhelmingly so, are all kind of the same. They're about the same size, namely big. They have, big intro classes. They're kind of the Penn State's University of Iowa's of the US. And I wanted more like a liberal arts college education. And even now, it doesn't exactly exist in Canada. Um, I also was sort of exposed to, I think, a bit of a wider world because my parents were very active in the peace movement, and they were also members of the Society of Friends. So, through various of those kinds of activities, like summer schools and summer camps and so forth, I was exposed to a kind of wider variety of people, including people who went to American colleges. And so I just kind of branched out and started doing research. I actually, as a 16-year-old, bought a book like American Universities A to Z, or as we say in Canada, A to Z, and kind of read through it. Now, the joke is like, oh, did you not get beyond A? And that's why you chose Antioch, but that's not true. I did actually get further. Um, and there was a very specific link too. There was, I grew up in a little town outside of Hamilton called Dundas. In Hamilton, there's a Reform synagogue that's, I think, probably still there in the western bit of Hamilton. I'm not it might be called Anshe Sholem. This is a very old memory. But the rabbi, um, whose name was Baskin, and actually he's the brother of a very famous artist, Leonard Baskin, I think. His name was Bernie Baskin. Anyway, his daughter, Judith, was my age. And sort of, even though she didn't go to my high school, I got to know her. And definitely her mom, and maybe the rabbi too, definitely her mom had gone to Antioch, and
mm,
then she went a year ahead of me. So there was even that personal connection. So that's a long story, but I think it kind of encapsulates how, like, a lot of people end up in places that maybe they weren't kind of on the path to go to. Like, yeah.
yeah, no, I totally get that because so both my parents went to Antioch and like met here. And when Antioch reopened, they wanted me to go like on a college tour just because they wanted to see it. And I was so adamant that I was like, I'm never gonna go here. Why would I want to go to this school in the middle of nowhere? And then of course I'm here and I'm gonna graduate next year. So yeah, paths definitely
That's
diverged.
funny. When were
Yeah.
your parents in Yellow Springs?
Um, they graduated, so my dad graduated in 94 and my mom in 96.
Okay,
Um, and so yeah, and I am gonna be class of 2022 now.
great.
So yeah. Um, so you came to Antioch. Do you have any like I feel like because you also came to Antioch in the 70s, which
I
every
started in 1968.
okay. So I feel like Antioch every like decade is like a completely different Antioch. Do you have anything that you would say like defined your experience at Antioch at that time?
Oh, I mean, it was an amazing time in American history, right?
Yeah.
And I think, through the 50s and the early 60s, Antioch was always a sort of political place, like for civil rights and so forth. Coretta Scott King is an alum and so forth. It was also a very serious liberal arts college where people did, rigorous liberal arts courses. Towards the end of the 60s, I think, because, there were the hippies and there was the anti-Vietnam War protests and all that, which, by the way, were very different. People tend to glom together, oh, the hippies, oh, the war protests. Basically, the hippies were like sitting in the sun smoking marijuana, and most of the people who were against the war in Vietnam, they might have, smoked a bit, but they were so serious, they tended not to do that stuff. It was much more disjoint than people usually portray it as being. Um, so the whole idea of the liberal arts rigorous thing had started to kind of atrophy. And so it was interesting. I mean, for me, and actually for my husband, because we met at Antioch also and are still together. Um, that was a little bit of a problem because we actually did want that kind of education, and it was actually getting a little difficult to get. Like, my husband was told by his advisor, like, what is it, you want to take a Shakespeare course? Why don't you just hang out in the Glen? And it was kind of like, really? I
No,
thought I
whoa,
was
okay.
going to take courses. So that was kind of funny. And indeed, he also went to Scotland. We were not a couple then. He went to St. Andrews. But I think one of the reasons we both went to Scotland was some desire to have that more rigorous education. But meanwhile, I'll just speak for myself. I think it was also good for me because I was a pretty serious intellectual person when I came, like maybe overly so, to loosen up a bit and to indeed go to the Glen. Like, I took a course called Changes and How to Relate to Them, which, now that I'm a professor, I think, what kind of course is that? And indeed, it had very minimal reading, and you spent a lot of time doing trust exercises and, stuff like that. But I think it was good for me. Um, but getting back to the times, I also think it was interesting because anti-war protests were a big part of American campuses. And indeed, when I was on co-op in Palo Alto, there were protests on the Stanford campus that spring, which I guess was the spring of '69. I forget exactly what had happened. We had, bombed Haiphong Harbor. I mean, we're always doing something, right? No, I think it was after the Kent State killings. It was the spring of '70. It was after those 4 people got shot at Kent State. But this didn't happen so much in Antioch because the faculty were as on board mostly as the students were. So there wasn't much point in protesting the war or any of that type stuff. So it was a little funny that way. The strike, which was a big deal in Antioch history, was the year after we graduated. That was '72, '73. So we knew a lot of people who were on campus in connection with the strike, which I do think it was a big watershed for Antioch. And I do think the administration very much mishandled it. It had been preceded, my graduating year, there was a strike. I was actually the co-president of the part-time employees union my senior year, and we negotiated a contract, but there was a strike by the sort of full-time employees. Um, And I actually accepted my degree not from the then president, Jim Dixon, but from Sadie, who was a woman who worked as a cook in the cafeteria. There was a sort of counter, don't take your degree from Jim Dixon thing, which was very Antioch.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. And that was, I think, the other tension on campus was that there was a separate Black dorm. They had started to accept African American students through, it was called the New Directions program. And those students had wanted to live separately. And that was just the start of a separatist thing rather than a we should integrate thing. So that was a big tension on campus, and not all African American students even wanted to be a part of it and so forth. So yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, the tension's definitely affected, but in a kind of different way.
Definitely. Yeah. There always seems to be kind of like an issue of the year, of the quarter, whatever it is that a lot of students kind of really want to put their energy behind and have tension with whoever is opposed to their ideas. So if you could like have a conversation with yourself at that time, would you like tell yourself anything, or would you like give any advice to yourself?
No, not really.
Wait,
I
why
mean,
not?
yeah, it's a very interesting question, by the way. There are other times in my life when I definitely would give myself advice um, about other things, but I don't really think so. Um, no, no, it's interesting, because it was a time when I was exploring, but I think in a good way. I'm kind of satisfied with how I ended up. I think I wouldn't have ended up where I did if I wouldn't have done that kind of exploration. I do think some of the people I knew at Antioch could have used some advice. Not everyone, not everyone thrived in that atmosphere. And I think that's actually always been the way at Antioch, even in its different incarnations, because it is, I think, I don't know as much about it today, a pretty intense place.
Yeah, there definitely is the saying that you kind of have to have the energy to like design your own degree and like own your education. I think that's how the form that it takes today is that it takes a particular student who has both like the energy and the organization, and just like the want to do all of that at the same time. So I could definitely see that different iterations of Antioch have similar tendencies.
We did have requirements, so design your own degree is definitely a pretty recent thing.
Mhm.
In fact, I still have occasional nightmares. People have nightmares about exams, different things. I have nightmares that that I didn't really graduate because I failed to get all the physical education credits I was supposed to, because it was actually based on a real thing. I was short, and in my very last quarter, I had to take 2 different phys ed courses. It's like not good.
Yeah, really. That's like it's like such a specific brand of like senioritis of like you have to, but it's like it's yeah, no, I totally get that. My
Right.
version of that is like worrying that I haven't submitted the right paperwork to like tell people that I'm gonna like that I'm a third year, because we have to like start submitting like your degree plan and like your senior capstone proposal. And I'm like, did I send that email? Did that person get my email? Is it in the
Right.
record? It's yeah. And
Uh-huh.
so but it's a good time.
Right. Right.
Um, so when you finished Antioch, where you went, where did you
I
get your master's?
So I didn't get a master's, and lots of times when you're in a PhD program, you don't, or you
Okay,
only get it by the by if you bother to file the paperwork, and lots of people don't. Yeah, no, I went straight to the PhD program at Harvard.
okay. And then did you have like a title for that or like a specialization when you were there?
Oh yeah, no, PhD work is always specialized. So you definitely apply to do, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, whatever. The particular program I was in was at that point called Personality and Developmental Studies, which was a kind of, Harvard made it up. Like personality didn't have that much to do with development. And indeed, the faculty in personality and the faculty of development didn't have that much in common. It was just sort of left over in a department reorganization that whatever. Actually, it is vaguely interesting. The department at that point at Harvard was called the Department of Psychology and Social Relations. And it indeed was glommed together from there had been a Department of Psychology, like up until right when I got there, that did very hardcore, like perception and, stuff with pigeons. B.F. Skinner was there, stuff like that. And a Department of Social Relations that actually maybe you would have been interested in. It had the social psychologists and the developmental psychologists and the personality psychologists, but it also had social anthropologists, it had primatologists, it had sociologists, and it was very intellectually vibrant. And a lot of people in the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s did really interesting work in that sort of intellectual ferment that was created by putting all those disciplines together. But I guess at some point in the late 60s or whatever, the powers that be at Harvard decided, no, wait a sec, we should have an anthro department and a soc department and a psych department, just like everybody else. And they kind of basically wrecked it all.
They
But
stopped wanting to.
I was in a bit that used to be, as it was called, SocRel, and it still had some of that social relations flavor.
Okay. Okay. And then what was the, I guess, did you have like a title for your doctor, or like what was your dissertation's title?
I forget the exact title. The title was on recognition, but the subject was recognition memory for pictures in children. And actually, one of the things that I would do if I were going back in time and giving myself advice is to give myself a lot of dissertation advice, because it wasn't a good dissertation. Actually, I would now. I mean, some of the questions that I was seeking to answer, I now realize were not answerable with the technology of the day. In fact, I had an idea, which isn't at all the idea, thank God, that I tried to implement, because I couldn't have. And I guess I sort of realized that, but well, it's complicated. But it involved eye tracking, and eye
Hmm.
tracking technology is only now really getting common, cheap, easy to use. It's still fairly tough to analyze. And even tougher is yoking eye tracking patterns so that somebody looks the way another person looks. And you sort of see, is there a consequence of the looking pattern per se, or does it have to be chosen by the person doing the looking? It's not just about where you look, it's about having the ideas guiding the looking that creates the memory. Um, so yes, I would advise myself that some ideas are great ideas, but you can't do them. I would advise myself that there's a lot of attention needs to be paid to statistical power. If you don't do a well-powered experiment or can't do one, you shouldn't bother doing it at all. I would give myself much better dissertation advice.
Okay, I see. Yeah, definitely a time that you kind of seem to wish to want to do things differently.
Yeah.
And so, what year did you graduate from your PhD program?
Actually, 76.
Okay.
So this is all, I mean, one thing about my career is it was startlingly, I graduated from Antioch in 4 years, not five. Now now it only takes 4 years, right?
Yeah, it's four
Yeah,
years.
it used to be 5 years because of the co-op program. The reason it was only four is that I took these exams. We used to have level one, level two, level three courses. And I took exams that allowed me to waive all my level one courses, which was basically a year's worth of work. And I could do that partly because in Ontario, we then had a grade 13, which I had done. Although it's not entirely why I waived level 1. But on the other hand, even having done grade 13, I was only 17 when I started at Antioch. I turned 18 the winter of my freshman year. So I graduated in 4 years. I'm like only 21. I go straight to grad school. I graduated with a PhD in 4 years. I mean, now, and even then, it often would take 5. Some people would linger, etc. So I'm 25. I get a job at Penn State right away. I mean, nowadays you have to do a postdoc pretty much to get an academic job. So I'm an assistant professor at 25. And it cannot be done now. I mean, that whole like chop chop going right through doing everything fast, you can't do it now.
I get that. Yeah, that's a really accelerated course. Even for standards back then, like that still sounds like you were on the high speed road.
Yeah, which again, I think I would give myself advice not to do it at such speed. I don't know if I would have taken a gap year either before Antioch or after Antioch. I do think I might have advised myself to take a 5th year at Antioch. Although if I had taken a 5th year, I probably would have changed my career path. One of the things that did happen senior year is, well, there were a couple of things. I took an amazing biology course, which I had not taken before, and got really interested in biology. And interestingly, if I had become a biologist, what most interested me was developmental biology, sort of how a, blastocyst turns into a embryo and into a fetus and etc. I don't know what it is about development that fascinates me. But I also, aside from being co-president of the Part-Time Employees Union, I got active in a kind of newly formed, and this was like a thing of the time, Women's Health Collective. This is when the Boston Women's Health Collective produced Our Bodies, Ourselves in the first edition. So that was very much something in the air. And a lot of those women were starting to be interested in going to med school. And of course, there'd been women doctors for 100 years, but not so many. And nowadays it's like 50-50 or more or whatever. So with the newfound interest in biology, I also think I might have gone to med school. You never know. Um, so I might advise myself to give myself more time to explore. On the other hand, since I'm happy the way it turned out, like, you
No
know what
harm,
I
no
mean,
foul.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. Yeah. So I don't know how big of a saying it was when you were here at Antioch, but right now it's a lot of be ashamed to die before you win a victory for humanity. And I guess the question is like, what does that mean to you? And do you think you have like achieved that in any sort of form?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think I certainly knew about it. I My impression is it's sort of conjured up a little bit more nowadays, like you hear it more often.
Hmm.
And as a consequence of hearing it more often through like the Antiochian or etc., I've thought about it more. Um, and even without that, given like, oh, the peace movement, the Quakers, all that stuff, I've thought about that sort of stuff. And, you know, m- my husband is actually now retired from a career doing healthcare kind of policy, safety stuff, etc. And I always think, well, he did very socially meaningful work, and I wonder if I did or am because I'm still doing it. But in a few ways, I think so. I mean, I've certainly there were already women in psychology, women in cognitive science, but it's now much more so. I've been active in women in cognitive science and et cetera. I like to think that helping joining our foremothers in forging a path for women in science is something that I've done. And some of my work has also involved, sex and gender issues. Because if you work on spatial thinking, you have to confront that, because there are many things in which, for whatever reason, and that's often what's in dispute, men do better than women on these tests. Um, and also, a lot of my research has translational implications for education, actually pre-K through university, and especially STEM education. And I think that's relevant. Um, so the women issue, the education issue, but then there's another thing, which is thinking about what is a victory for humanity. So I think one of the attributes of humanity is wanting to understand ourselves and understand our circumstances. So, in famously, some Egyptian pharaoh wanted to find out how, I mean, this is probably not true, but, how do children learn language? By, shutting up a kid in a pyramid or whatever and seeing, oh, did he start to speak, Coptic or whatever? Like, what is the basic language? But the point of this story is that people wonder about these kinds of things. So I guess I see pushing back the frontiers of knowledge as part of winning a victory for humanity. And sometimes when Antiochians talk about this saying, I think they don't include that kind of victory. So,
Wow. Yeah, I really like that. I've never really heard that perspective because it's always been kind of much more linked to social justice, which is still like a very like interesting and important part of I think this idea. But I've never heard it in this context, so I really like that actually.
well, thanks.
So
I think that's what, I mean, I think social justice is what Horace Mann meant by it, but yeah, it's my own construal.
definitely, which we need because you got to have different ideas.
Yeah.
So um So outside of like all your education and your research and your teaching, what are like your interests and your hobbies? Like how else do you spend your time?
No. Well, I do a lot of reading that isn't psychology reading, some of which is, you know, trashy reading. I sort of love mystery novels and series, and especially ones with women protagonists and stuff like that. I actually think they're interesting. I mean, one of the things I might like to do sometime if I do retire and have time is write a blog about these mystery books, because I think they reflect a lot of things about society and the different eras in which they are written. And you also learn a lot. Like, I've read things that are set in, Japan in the 1500s and stuff. It's a very painless way to learn history. I do gardening. I spent an intense couple of years doing some family history. Um, I don't do it anymore. It was sort of a bent that I did. I walk a lot. I like to hike. I don't have highly official hobbies like, a fly fisherwoman or something like that, or.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's always just nice to hear kind of like what people do when they aren't doing their like work thing because I don't know. I feel like at least right now, I feel like all I'm doing is like writing papers and I have to remind myself that I like to go on walks and I like to go on bike rides. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
def-
yeah. I
yeah.
think it's super important.
Definitely. And so do you have any like future goals for like your research or for your career path? You kind of talked about wanting to retire soon. Is that something?
Oh, no, it's not wanting to retire. It's just kind of thinking I ought to retire, frankly. I mean, at some
Okay.
point, don't you need to like a step aside? But no, because I am only 1 year into a 5-year grant. So I'm kind of committed for at least another 4 years. And I wasn't necessarily going to admit more grad students, but somebody came along who really, really suited this research program that the grant is funding. And so he's going to start in the fall, and that's at least a 4-year commitment. I mean, the 5th year, you could sort of supervise a dissertation as an emerita professor. But the joke is that I keep saying I'll retire in 5 years, except I started saying it 10 years ago.
Yes. Well, you could always say that your retirement is just the life that you're doing right now because you're choosing it. So,
Yeah, yeah.
well, nice. That sounds like a
But
good
in terms
time.
of goals, I mean, this is the trouble, frankly, with your goal being, rolling back the frontiers of human knowledge, because you're never going to like roll them back all the way. Um,
Yeah, there's always more
yeah.
that you can do, so you want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, to get back to psychology, what I did not realize when I entered grad school in 1972 is that the history of psychology was at best 100 years old. And that's even, counting the, William James doing kind of armchair psychology and some of the vaguely boring stuff that Ebbinghaus and people were doing in Germany, Helmholtz and so forth. And at least in the United States, I feel like, although some people would disagree, it had been sort of sidetracked by the B.F. Skinner stuff and some of the obsession with just stimulus response psychology. I mean, I
Mhm.
do think we learned something from it, but it became so focused on a very limited worldview that I think it was a problem. So anyway, I didn't realize what a young discipline it was and how lacking we were in not only like technological techniques like the eye movement stuff, but also statistical techniques. Like when I took statistics from Bob McCall, it was like, okay, well, fine, there's statistics, I should learn them. I mean, even now, people are doing statistical research. I mean, we don't understand as well as we should how to analyze data. So in the 50 years that I've done this stuff, we've made tremendous advances. And what I think that has done is to make it much more of a mature science, which is to say, it's quite clear what we don't know.
Okay.
But so that's a motivator, right? Because now that through half a century of fumbling around and making advances basically in techniques, but also gathering a lot of knowledge, much of it descriptive, but you need to start with description, etc. I think it's becoming increasingly clear what we want to know and how you would get to know it, even though in some cases we currently lack the techniques for figuring out what it is. That makes it a little frustrating to stop, because now that you know the questions and you can maybe even answer some of them, it's sort of like, okay, fine, I want to know the answer.
Which means that you keep doing the work and then you keep
Right.
pushing back your retirement for another 10 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think that some of the like advancement would come with more interdisciplinary studies of like psychology and something?
Well, yes, but let me caveat that a little bit. Disciplines themselves are artificial, right? And like, why is sociology different from anthropology? Why is social psychology a kind of psychology and not part of sociology? Why is behavioral neuroscience in psychology departments and not in biology departments? The answer is, who the hell knows? There isn't a good reason for quite a lot of the disciplinary configurations we have. So, what I think about this is that when you collaborate with people, who do computer science, or if you're interested in STEM education, with people who actually teach physics, or you collaborate with a physicist in running an fMRI facility, which, brain imaging needs a physicist. It's a whole like new thing that physicists do this. Um, if you collaborate with a sociologist or anthropologist, we need to be flexible. So when you, and it, so, and the other thing is, it's hard because disciplines have become entrenched. And even within psychology, frankly, I know almost nothing about social psychology. I never go to their conferences, I don't read their journals, etc. So there are distinct controversies, every term means something to them and I don't know what it means, etc. So as you work on a problem and seek out partners from other disciplines to help you solve the problem, you have to be set to do really, really hard work in communicating. So what I don't think there should necessarily be is like, oh, a department of interdisciplinary studies or you know, it needs to be very flexible. And so as we create the structure of universities, and sadly, people often don't pay attention to this, it would be desirable, in my view, to set up incentives for flexibility. Instead, many modern universities set up disincentives, and that's really a problem.
Hmm. That is really interesting because like right now we're looking at like our capstone, so it's kind of like you at Antioch you kind of like choose which is like your main area of study. So like mine would be psychology, but then you kind of your motivations can be from any of the disciplines, and you kind of just have to make your case and state why, which I think is something that for me as like a student I was really interested in, because the idea of like being told that you shouldn't work with this other department because they are you're in department, yeah, I agree, it just feels very counterintuitive, and so
Yeah,
I guess it's something I've enjoyed here.
yeah,
um
good.
so it looks like we are coming up on time, but do you want to tell us anything about like your upcoming alumni lecture, kind of like a preview almost?
Well, I did mention that a lot of my work has concerned sex differences and has concerned STEM education and has concerned spatial thinking. So it's kind of putting together those themes. I want to tell people what spatial thinking is, how it's relevant, starting with really little kids to thinking about math, and how it runs through thinking about science and math as they grow older, how it develops. Um, a little bit about why it might show sex differences, although I kind of think that's the wrong question. I'll try to explain why it's the wrong question. Um, and yeah, that's what I hope to do.
That sounds really interesting. So if people want to put it on their calendars, when is it happening?
Oh, I thought you do better than I.
Oh
Let me
no.
check my calendar. It's happening. When is it happening? It's Saturday, April 10 at 4 Eastern.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Yay! So we got a date, a time, we got a topic.
Yeah,
Um,
great.
thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really enjoyed it. And
Oh, thank you. It was really fun to talk to a contemporary student and such an articulate one.
oh, I think I know. I want to. I just want to ask you all my questions that aren't like part of the interview. But now I'm like, can we talk about these other things? But no.
Oh,
Yes, it's a good time.
okay. Well, some other time.
Yes,
Hi,
definitely. I'm
Eric.
looking forward to your alumni conference lecture thing.
Okay, good. I'll see you, I hope, then.
Yeah,
Thank you
Okay.
definitely.
both.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.